Do not laugh, but once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and the cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the east. And while possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things, it should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land long now steeped in poetry. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. Our opening quote this week comes from perhaps the most famous of Professor Tolkien's letters, letter 131 to Milton Waldman, who Tolkien was trying to persuade to publish both The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion. And what better way is there of demonstrating their interdependence than writing more than 10,000 words of brilliantly dense summary of the entire history of Arda? This week, though, we're concentrating on the passage near the beginning of the letter wherein Tolkien lays out his highest level goal when preparing the legendarium, no less than a comprehensive mythology dedicated to, founded on, intertwined with England. And a mythology, moreover, that will be open to other creators. Now, lest you come away from this episode thinking of the professor as some laissez-faire Creative Commons public domain kind of author, let's note two things right up front. The first is that Tolkien was exacting when it came to the material published under his own name and held strong opinions about the adaptations produced during his lifetime. Not because they were adaptations, but because of the specific choices made or not made by those adapters. The second is that the holders of the Tolkien rights after his death, and particularly in the era of the internet, have earned a reputation as, let's say, strict, let's say zealous enforcers of the estate's copyright claims, which, when it comes to selling artwork or publishing a completely unofficial sequel to The Lord of the Rings and then suing Amazon for $250 million, the link to that tawdry little story is in the show notes, all of that seems pretty defensible. But it's telling that in 2012, the company backed off from legal action and offered very cheap licensing terms to the Hobbit pub in Southampton, England, specifically because they were becoming known for their heavy-handed approach to litigation, and it was starting to sour the brand. I should take a second here to disentangle the companies that I'm casually referring to as the Tolkien estate, because the situation is, as always, a little more complicated than perhaps it ought to be. There's the actual Tolkien estate, capital T, capital E, which holds the rights to the books and was run for a long time by Christopher Tolkien. The estate, however, doesn't control the movie rights, nor the merchandising rights, which were sold by the professor himself in 1969 to United Artists, the studio founded by Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks and W.D. Griffith. Tolkien was paid the princely sum of £100,000 in 1969, that's about $2.8 million in today's money, as well as a 7% take of future revenue, which has since passed to the estate. United Artists were riding high at the end of the 1960s, but by the mid-1970s they had failed to put together a project for the Tolkien works. At that point, the rights to The Lord of the Rings and most of the rights to The Hobbit were bought from United Artists by Hollywood legend Saul Zaentz. Zaentz formed Tolkien Enterprises in 1977, which changed its name in 2010 to Middle-earth Enterprises, and was sold in 2022 to the Embracer Group, a Swedish media holding company which also owns dozens of video game companies and the entirety of Dark Horse, the comics company, among many, many other endeavors. Middle-earth Enterprises still owns the movie, video game, stage, and merchandising rights for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, as well as matching rights, a kind of first refusal for works developed from the Silmarillion or the Unfinished Tales. It is Middle-earth Enterprises, then Tolkien Enterprises, that was getting a reputation for being pretty trigger-happy when it came to perceived breaches of their copyright in the late 2000s and the 2010s. This is why, by the way, the estate proper didn't have a lot to say about the Jackson movies. They had no control over the content of the films because that license was owned by Tolkien Enterprises, licensed to New Line. The estate sued New Line in 2008 for unpaid royalties, that's that 7% that I mentioned before, and the case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount of money. The TV rights were sold by the Tolkien estate for the first time in 2017 to Amazon, who also now own MGM, which in turn owns what's left of United Artists, which still holds part of the rights to The Hobbit from that original purchase in 1969, the part that wasn't sold to Saul's Ants. New Line also opened the door to cooperating with Amazon and sharing some of their licensed material, design materials mostly, but then stepped back. At the same time, Simon Tolkien, Christopher's eldest son and one of the board members of the estate, gave Amazon permission to include a few details from the unfinished tales which weren't explicitly licensed, which is why armchair critics of the Rings of Power generally present a more straightforward picture of what Amazon is and is not allowed to use than is actually accurate. It is a mess. And it gets even wilder because any individual part of these rights can be licensed by the rights holder so that other companies can temporarily use it. A state of affairs which can be cancelled at any time, all of which is why contract lawyers are very, very wealthy people. But surely, you may be thinking, there's a limit to all of this. Eventually, Tolkien's works will shake off the chains of copyright and roam free in the public domain, won't they? And the answer is, probably not. The Hobbit is already in the public domain in certain parts of the world, including New Zealand. It's scheduled to enter the public domain in the US in 2032, that is 95 years after its initial publication. In the UK, it won't be until 2044, 70 years after the professor's death. But honestly, I wouldn't be too hopeful. The renewal process is incredibly complex and arcane, and if you throw enough money at it, it'll keep the rights locked up for as long as it's profitable. Though, while the merit of what is effectively copyright in perpetuity goes beyond the scope of this podcast for sure, it certainly raises some questions about how we can navigate creative works which are so successful and influential that they are to some extent absorbed into the culture. Because while it may seem monolithic, Warner can make things derivative of the Jackson trilogies, and Electronic Arts has the video game license except for Lord of the Rings Online, which is owned by Daybreak. Games Workshop can make miniatures games, and Free League can make role-playing games, and, well, it's a mess. But in its desire to exploit still further the intellectual property left by the professor, there is an argument that it has, in some ways, achieved his goal. So many other minds, so many other hands, all laboring to create new versions of these stories. And it's kind of worked, right? The Lord of the Rings exists independently of any one instance or rendering. It is accessible in books and in movies, in audiobooks and in radio dramas, in comics, in fan films, in video games and stage musicals, in Lego sets and Funko Pops. It is available at every stall at your local Renaissance fair. That iconography is everywhere, and in that way, perhaps Tolkien came closer to his stated goal than he realized. In this episode, though, we're going to talk through the history of Tolkien adaptation and how Tolkien's work has taken these different shapes over the years. All of this is interesting enough on its own, certainly, or at least I think so, but I'm also setting the stage for a discussion next week on what is one of the, let's say, stranger adaptations. I'm referring, of course, to the 2024 movie The War of the Rohirrim, directed by Kenji Kamiyama. So if you haven't seen that movie yet, or if you want to let me know what you think about it, you have until next Sunday to do so. Obviously, Tolkien's influence extends far beyond official licensed adaptations of his work. Without Tolkien, the landscape of modern fantasy would be completely different, but that is also a topic for another day. We're going to focus this week on actual adaptations, and we're going to limit ourselves largely to the English language Anglo-American adaptations because the impact of Tolkien's work in other countries is also a more significant topic, best kept for another day. The first of these adaptations was, appropriately enough, The Lord of the Rings, a 12-part BBC radio dramatization released between 1955 and 1956. Tolkien, per his letters, did not enjoy it very much. Sadly, the recordings of those broadcasts, like so much radio from that era, have been lost. I say that's the first adaptation, and it certainly is in terms of a wide audience, but it does come with a technical asterisk. The actual first adaptation of Tolkien's work that I can find, at least, is a 1953 stage adaptation of The Hobbit, produced at St. Margaret's Girls' School in Edinburgh, performed for a private audience of students and parents. This is followed in 1959 by a very limited production in the Yale Drama School of a new adaptation, and then in 1967 by a musical adaptation performed in Oxford, co-written by one Humphrey Carpenter, who would later go on to write the authorized biography of Tolkien and edit together the book of the professor's letters. There's a 4-hour BBC Radio 4 adaptation of The Hobbit, which airs in the fall of 1968, adapted by actor Michael Kilgarriff, which sadly doesn't seem to have left much of an impression with the public. But it isn't until the late 1970s and the huge countercultural success of Tolkien's work that the adaptations really start in earnest. The first of these is the Rankin-Bass 1977 adaptation of The Hobbit, written by Romeo Mueller, who also wrote all those Rankin-Bass specials that I've been assured that Americans of more than 30 years of age have a genuinely unironic appreciation for. I don't quite see it myself. As I say, I didn't grow up with them, so they don't have the same impact for me, but I'm sure that they're good enough on their own terms. And honestly, the same might be said of this TV special too. Certainly, I do know many Tolkien fans who seem to genuinely enjoy it, and I do owe it, I suppose, a real open-hearted rewatch. Parenthetically, the thing that might be most interesting about the 1977 Hobbit and its sequel, which I'll discuss in a moment, is that the animation studio, Topcraft, would go on to produce Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, and then in 1985 basically reform itself as the incomparable Studio Ghibli. The Ralph Bakshi animated movie The Lord of the Rings is released a year after The Hobbit in November of 1978, and despite making more than $30 million off of a budget of only $4 million, Bakshi found the critical response disheartening, and the second part of the proposed duology was never made. So in 1980, the ball is bounced back to Rankin-Bass for The Return of the King, an audacious semi-sequel to both the 77 Hobbit and the 78 Lord of the Rings. Its uneasy origins are perhaps best exemplified by the original working title, Frodo the Hobbit 2. This movie, I admit, and I know I'm going to get emails about this, is no more impressive to me than the 77 Hobbit, but again, I do need to rewatch these. Maybe we'll do them at Christmas or something. We'll turn it into a yearly feature of the Shire Reckoning calendar. There's a largely forgotten American radio adaptation in 1979 and a BBC Jackanory adaptation that same year, but it's in 1981 that the BBC released their brand new 26-part radio adaptation starring Ian Holm as Frodo, Bill Nighy as Sam, Michael Hordern as Gandalf, and Paul Brook as Grima Wormtongue. And if you don't recognize the name Paul Brook, then you should know that he was a fixture in B-tier British television of the 80s and 90s, and also played famously the Rancor Keeper in Return of the Jedi. These are the facts you come to Shire Reckoning to learn. That series, the 81 BBC series, is still, I think, recognized as one of the high points in the history of Tolkien adaptations. In 82, just the next year, we arrive at an unusual and significant milestone thanks to the fine folks at Melbourne House. The first official Tolkien video game is released. The text-adventure game The Hobbit was both technically impressive and hugely commercially successful. Released on the Amstrad CPC, the Apple II, the BBC Micro, the Commodore 64, the Dragon 64, the IBM PC, the Apple Mac, the Auric, and the ZX Spectrum. I have recently poked around with this game just a little bit, and I'm definitely going to stream it over on the Patreon page. That's patreon.com/nextword in the near future. If you really want to sit and watch me play a text adventure from the mid-1990s, it could be a lot of fun. It might actually be fun to play through all of those early games. There are 3 more text adventures by Melbourne House, and at least 1 produced by another studio. I'm not going to go too far down the history of video games in this episode because that, too, could be an episode all its own, but I should call out the completely unofficial roguelike game Moria, released in 1983, which I played for hours and hours and hours on my Amiga 500 back in the late 1980s. And I'm mindful as I say this that I never sound more Scottish than when I talk about whiskey, but I never sound more British than when I talk about the computers I used growing up. In 1990, Rob Inglis records and releases what is still, for many, the definitive audiobook version of The Lord of the Rings. A year later, he does the same for The Hobbit. Then, in 1995, Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh begin to investigate the rights to Tolkien's work, and a long, laborious production cycle begins, culminating in the release of The Fellowship of the Ring in 2001, The Two Towers in 2002, and The Return of the King in 2003. Speculation immediately follows about the development of new movies based on The Hobbit. Principal photography begins on what is originally intended to be 2 movies and later becomes 3 in 2011. Between those 2 production cycles, the very big budget The Lord of the Rings musical opened in Toronto, then transferred in an abridged form to London. The Guardian newspaper described it at the time as, quote, the most costly musical mistake in West End history, end quote. And let me tell you, that will also make a fantastic topic for a future episode. In 2017 then, with the settling of legal issues between Warner Brothers and the Tolkien estate, they start shopping around rights for a TV show, which, as I said, had never been sold. HBO suggests a remake of the trilogy, and the estate says no. Netflix suggests an interconnected anthology of stories set around the time of The Lord of the Rings. This is almost definitely the Young Aragorn Adventures idea. Amazon doesn't have an idea. Instead, they come to the estate with a pledge to develop the story together and, quote very much unquote, protect Tolkien's legacy. They end up buying the rights for $250 million with a 5-season commitment and the opportunity to develop spin-off stories. They then take pitches from more than 30 writers who present stories based on every possible part of the legendarium and timeline, from young Aragorn to Gimli in the Fourth Age, to the successful pitch made by J.D. Payne and Patrick Mackay, putting the Second Age of Middle-earth into a blender and seeing what happens next. The last notable adaptations, as of this recording at least, stem from Andy Serkis's live reading of The Hobbit during the COVID-19 lockdown, which raised more than $350,000 for health charities. 2 months later, HarperCollins announced that Serkis would produce a new audiobook version of The Hobbit. A year later, they released a new version of The Lord of the Rings. These are inarguably important, valuable, well-researched versions of both books, though, as I've said before, for my taste, they can be a little exhausting to listen to casually. I still use the English for my everyday reading and the Serkis only for special occasions. All of which takes us through labyrinthine ways to the 2024 release of The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, the animated story of Helm Hammerhand of Rohan. We'll talk about that next week, but just to close out this overview, I want to consider what distinguishes the good adaptation from the bad. In general, adaptations are inherently transformative. The naive idea of just do it the way that it is in the book falls apart immediately once you start thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of different media, different forms, different tones, different audiences. In general, I think Tolkien fans want adaptations to be accurate to the text on the page, but also, and therein often lies the problem, accurate to the spirit of the text. And when those two things are incompatible in this new form, in this new adaptation, well, you have to make a call. You have to make a choice. I've said before, I think, that one of the strengths of the Jackson films, the Lord of the Rings trilogy at least, is that I can see the underlying reason for every change that is made to the original text. I don't necessarily agree with all of those changes, but in every case that I can think of, I can see the issue in the book that the movie is trying to address. I understand why Saruman and Gandalf have their wizard duel at Orthanc, because what happens in the book is excellent, but it's not visually dramatic. I understand why we compress time and space across the entire trilogy, because these things are difficult to communicate on screen. I understand, though I do not endorse, the cutting of Bombadil and the Old Forest and the Barrows. By the time we get to the Desolation of Smaug, however, the second Hobbit film, the reasons that changes are being made are, well, much less consistently accessible to the viewer. I get the inclusion of Tariel, right? We want more female characters. We want some romantic chemistry. Here, we is standing in for the production company, and we want someone to give us insight and interiority in the woodland realm. Again, I might not agree with it, but I can see the thinking. And the same is true of the running battle between the dwarves and Smaug at the end of the film, for example, right? The movie wants a climactic confrontation that fits this trilogy structure while preserving an action sequence for the opening of the third film. And the average moviegoer didn't sit through 6 hours of these Hobbit movies to not see the heroes fight a dragon. But then, there are other choices that are just baffling. The running battle on the river, and the tombs of the Nazgul, and the light of the moon revealing the keyhole at the Lonely Mountain. These are changes that are made for reasons which elude me, for reasons which don't solve anything in the plot, for reasons which are actively combative with the original text. And that gets right to the heart, I think, of what makes a good adaptation. We have to make changes. Considering Tolkien's encouragement of other minds and other hands, we ought to make changes. But we should be mindful of the reasons that we're making those changes. We should ask the question and then see if we can't find an answer that is similar to that which Tolkien himself would have given, something that fits with the rest of the story. So where do we go from here? Well, I've said before that the Hunt for Gollum is going to function in part at least as a test of the audience's appetite for a remake of the trilogy. but I'm not sure that the continuity with the Jackson versions isn't going to undercut the efficacy of that test. It could, in the end, simply confirm that the audience still loves the Jackson movies, which, isn't really news to anyone. If it were down to me, acknowledging the fact that a remake of The Lord of the Rings is absolutely inevitable, then I'd want to prime the pump. I'd want to set the stage. I'd want to buy some time and space with something different, with a new story, a new tone somewhere else in Middle-earth. Give me the fall of Arthedain and the war against Angmar. Follow the Blue Wizards into the east and give me an entirely different perspective on the war with Sauron. Then, maybe, we'll be able to come back to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which, straight up, since you asked, I would adapt together as a 4 or 5 movie series, beginning with The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings, repositioning the earlier work in the tone of the latter, just as Tolkien began to do late in his career. Or, as the internet decides every 6 months or so, you could just make the trilogy again, this time with Muppets. Don't tell me that you don't want to see Statler and Waldorf as Theoden and Denethor, or Sam the Eagle as Elrond. Come on, it basically writes itself. Next week then, The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. Get in touch and let me know what you think about this film as a film and as an adaptation of an earlier text. Does it fulfill the promise of this story, or does it squander it? I can't wait to hear what you all have to say. Since this whole episode has been a little light on the original books, let's get back to the text itself with a great question from William, not, he assures me, the troll, thank you William for clarifying that, who has thoughts on Denethor. William writes, there are a lot of reflections and mirror images between Rohan and Gondor. One gets Merry, one gets Pippin, one gets Theodred, one gets Boromir, one gets Helm's Deep, one gets Pelennor Fields. Because of this, I'm always surprised that Theoden seems very popular with Tolkien readers, but Denethor is seen as a villain. Is the influence of Saruman over Theoden more relatable than the influence of Sauron over Denethor? Why isn't Denethor seen as the tragic figure he so clearly is? End quote. And William, this is a great question. I'm going to divide the answer into 2 parts, the first fairly short, the second a little longer. The first short answer is this. For the Tolkien fan in 2025, we can blame Peter Jackson. The treatment of Theoden in the movies is clearly heroic and kingly, this rejection of despair, this taking up of defiance. Denethor, by contrast, begins in a pretty dark place and only gets worse, which is no reflection on the brilliance of John Noble, but is pretty clearly a choice made by the filmmakers early in the adaptive process. Theoden gets all of the heroism, he gets the speeches, he gets the light behind him, and Denethor gets turned into a meme about cherry tomatoes. And there are substantive changes too, like Denethor sending Faramir off to Osgiliath on a suicide mission, right? In the book, this is the decision of the Council of Minas Tirith, and it seems more strategically sound. And in Denethor's refusal to light the beacons for Rohan. In the book, he does light them, he just doesn't think that it'll matter. So movie Denethor, simply consumed by grief at the loss of Boromir, then takes a number of actions which are pretty hard to justify. It is tough to get behind movie Denethor. But the book is, as always, a more complicated thing. Denethor's story begins as one of loss and self-doubt, and it's a self-doubt that is triggered in part by Aragorn, because Aragorn comes to Gondor when he's a young man, when he's going by the name Thorongil, and he serves Denethor's father Ecthelion. And he's Aragorn, he's kind of the best dude, so the people of Gondor love him, and Ecthelion loves him, and Denethor is kind of envious and kind of insecure. Then Aragorn goes off to have his adventures in the east, and Denethor gets married. But when Ecthelion dies and Denethor becomes steward, his people are still comparing him unfavorably to Aragorn, who hasn't been around for years. And then, 4 years after the death of his father, Denethor's wife dies too. And he, in his grief, in what we might speculate is an attempt to prove himself worthy of his position, he turns to the Honor Stone, the Palantir of Minas Tirith. He desires knowledge, and desires the power that comes from that knowledge, and what he finds instead is Sauron, who possesses the Palantir from Minas Ithil, now Minas Morgul. And as Gandalf later says, Sauron shows Denethor exactly what he wants to show him, in order to break the spirit of the last ruling steward. The Palantir may not lie, but it certainly doesn't show the whole truth. Even at the very end of his life, having lost all his hope, Denethor fails to see the sign of eucatastrophe in the arrival of the black ships of Umbar, which he doesn't know are under the command of Aragorn, that rescue is coming rather than final condemnation. He doesn't get the life that he wants. Quote, "To be the lord of this city in peace and leave my chair to a son after me who would be his own master and no wizard's pupil." End quote. In the end, then, we have this kind of reflection, as you say, William, between Rohan and Gondor, albeit a bitter one. Theoden dies as the ultimate exemplar of his culture, heroic on the field of battle, and in that sense, he wins. But Denethor unambiguously fails. He even says as much, consumed by his despair and his grief. Quote, "No tomb for Denethor and Faramir. No tomb. No long, slow sleep of death embalmed. We will burn like heathen kings before ever a ship sailed hither from the west. The west has failed. Go back and burn." End quote. In his death, Theoden affirms what Rohan stands for. In his death, Denethor sees his own failure as a father, his own failure as a steward, and ultimately the failure of the men of the West. But much of this, perhaps all of this, is the product of his long exposure to the terrible will of Sauron. And what remains is his pride. That same pride that tells him that he can use the Palantir safely, and that same pride that tells him that he should wield the ring against Sauron. Now, we might see Denethor as a wartime leader, forced to take desperate measures to protect his city, his people, though Tolkien is pretty clear that the end never justifies the means, but perhaps that's a conversation for another time. Denethor gets zoom-bombed by Sauron himself, and we should note that if he's not as successful at resisting the will of Sauron as Aragorn is, he is still arguably better than Saruman is. The wise say that using the ring would be disastrous, and Denethor disagrees, but that doesn't necessarily make him evil, any more than Boromir saying the exact same thing at the Council of Elrond makes him evil. In the end, William, I think you're right. I think that Denethor is a victim of Sauron and the Shadow as surely as Theoden is. And it's tempting, of course, to see the difference, to read the difference between the two as being the difference between an actual king and a guy who's keeping the king's chair warm. But rather than accepting Gandalf's healing and guidance as Theoden does, Denethor, alienated from Gandalf by his own suspicion, by his own insecurity, turns instead one last time to the Palantir and the proof of Sauron's power and might. I think it is an undeniably, classically tragic arc for a character who Jackson doesn't handle particularly well, and in fact, a character which might indicate a weak spot in Jackson's approach to the story in the first place. It may well be said that Jackson is good, or Jackson is at his best, with the down-to-earth, low-level stuff, the Shire and Bree, and with the men of Rohan. But maybe not so good with the grandeur, the majesty, the height of the high man of Númenórean descent. Thanks so much for that, William. I hope you've moved the needle for Shire Reckoning listeners, and that we all look a little more kindly on Denethor the next time we read through these books. If you have questions, dear listener, then please do get in touch and ask them, and I really mean it, because the question bucket is getting a little low, particularly after my unexpected week off last week. You can email me directly, shirereckoningpod@gmail.com, or you can follow me in all the usual social media spaces at Shire Reckoning Pod. Much to my surprise, the response to the last question of the week was vaguely but universally positive, and it seems as though spirits are ill-defined but kind of generally high for The Hunt for Gollum, which is now, by the way, set to release on December the 17th, 2027. That's right, not 2026 as previously announced, but a whole year later. It seems as though we're going to be talking about this film for a while. So this week's question, spinning out of our conversation about adaptation, is a pretty simple one. Which stories from the Legendarium would you like to see adapted for the big screen in the years to come? Are you eager for Beren and Luthien? Are you eager for The Voyage of Eärendil? Something from the First Age, something from the Fourth Age, somewhere in between? Do you have a director that you would really love to see take on Tolkien? Get in touch and let me know. And speaking as we were of adaptation, September the 1st, tomorrow, as of this recording, is, believe it or not, the 3rd anniversary of the release of the first 2 episodes of Rings of Power all the way back in 2022, which seems like simultaneously yesterday and a lifetime ago. September 3rd marks the 19th anniversary of the close of the Lord of the Rings musical in Toronto. September 4th, 1970, marked the very first MythCon, the conference of the Mythopoetic Society in California. I am hoping to attend MythCon 54 next year here in Weatherford, Oklahoma. Stay tuned for updates on that. And of course, very sadly, September 2nd marks the 52nd anniversary of the professor's death. I'll be raising a glass of whiskey to his memory. In Arda, it's a quiet week. On September 5th, in the second year of the Third Age, Isildur leaves Gondor to go to Arnor in the north and take the throne of his father. He, of course, won't make it past the Gladden Fields. On the 6th of September, a brief 3,017 years later, the party travelling north after the War of the Ring pauses for a full week by the Hollin Gate. Next week, they will take their leave of Galadriel and Celeborn. And if it has been a relatively quiet week in Arda, it has been here in the real world a very strong week for scholarship. I want to recommend in the strongest possible terms, with the greatest amount of enthusiasm, Tom Hillman's piece, Tolkien, the Monsters and the Fascists, an excellent and passionate examination of the professor's opposition to fascism and those who support it throughout his entire life, starting with my favourite Faramir quote, and honestly going up from there. Robin Reed, one of the most important voices in feminist Tolkien criticism, published this week a post entitled An Incomplete Academic Fellowship Excluding Queer Feminist Women from Tolkien Studies, which begins with a response to Jane Chance's Tolkien Self and Other This Queer Creature, and goes on to gloss the current state of queerness in this critical space, and ultimately she shares her own goals in her current work, which are excellently applicable to anyone interested in doing this kind of work, or simply being a better reader. I also recommend, for the second episode in a row, in fact, the work of Sarah Brown, though this one comes with a caveat. Absolutely do go and read her paper, Of Their Women We Hear Less, Pride and Prejudice in the Tale of Aldarion and Arendis, but only read that paper after you have read Aldarion and Arendis in Unfinished Tales, and maybe only after the Shire Reckoning episode on Aldarion and Arendis, which I will hopefully get to before we are done with September. If you don't know what Aldarion and Arendis is, stick around, because it is one of the most unique stories in the entire legendarium. And if you're listening to this in the aftermath of DragonCon in Atlanta, I hope it was fantastic. Some year soon, I'm going to make it out there too. That will do it for this week on Shire Reckoning. Join me on Tuesday for our seminar session on Chapter 6 of The Hobbit, Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire, in which, in addition to discussing the aftermath of the party's time beneath the Misty Mountains, I'm going to talk a little about how we see The Hobbit as a primer for The Lord of the Rings, how it teaches us to read the subsequent text too. That's Tuesday evening, September 2nd, 9 p.m. Central Time. To get the link to join me live, all you have to do is head on over to patreon.com/nextword. You can follow that page for free. That will get you the links to the live sessions. Or better yet, you can help support independent and ad-free podcasting by pledging $5 a month to help me keep doing this work for a long time to come. That also gets you an invitation to the super secret, very exclusive Last Call at the Green Dragon after show right after every live seminar session. That'll do it for another Sunday. Thank you all so much for listening and for your correspondence. I'll talk to you again soon. Until next time, Aure and Teluva.